Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. You are listening to our weekly class, Navigate and Master the Prayerbook, with Rabbi Cantor Hillary Chorny.
Let's start from the beginning of where we left off last week. A little reminder about the scope of this particular class. The scope of this class is not learning to lead morning services. It's not learning to be an expert. It's not learning to do deep dives in the history of where our liturgy came from. The idea is to learn to navigate services like a professional member of the congregation. I want you to feel like you have ownership over this liturgy. Like when you walk into services, you know what you're doing. Like you know where we are. And even if you were to walk into another set of services in a place other than what you would call your home spiritual community, that you would be able to say, I know where we are. I get a sense of what we're doing. And if you walked into this class, or if you're listening to this and you're thinking, I kind of already know what happens during weekday services, that this gives you that extra bit of expertise for you to say, I see what they did here. I see that we're doing something a little bit different. Or I notice that today must be a special day because there's a change here in the liturgy. Or this must be a special prayer book because there's a change here in the liturgy. So last time, we dove into the weekday siddur by looking at the beginning warm-up liturgy called Birkot HaShachar. And we talked a little bit about the beginning liturgy that we do even at home, even before we get to the synagogue. We talked about how in Israel, still to this day, we don't start from Birkot HaShachar in the synagogue space, but we actually do those morning blessings. We do them at home with the morning rituals. This is also true on Shabbat as well. And then we go into the Shacharit service, but before we can get into that, we need to warm up. And those warm-up services are called Pesukei DeZimra. We didn't talk about this last week, but that phrase is Aramaic for Pesukim Shel Zimra, verses of song or poetry. Last week, we spent a lot of time talking about the three elements of prayer, or the three elements of every prayer book. And those three elements are poetry, blessings, and excerpts from the biblical canon. And what we looked at last week is how so many elements from the very beginning of services, from Birkot HaShachar and Pesukei DeZimra, where we started digging in last week and where we'll pick up today, are crossovers between those two categories. Like, for example, Shirat Hayam, which we'll look at a little bit more in depth today, which is both a piece of poetry and obviously comes from our biblical canon because it's found in Parshat Beshalach in the middle of the book of Shmot, of Exodus. So that falls into both of those categories, right? So we spoke about those warm-up services. We spoke about getting into the beginnings of prayer. And let's take a look at that prayer skeleton all together. I'm going to share with you in the chat a link, once again, to that prayer skeleton, which I remind you, if you're pretty tactile and you like to take notes on your own while we're going through this, you can make a copy of this document for yourself. And you can take your own notes on it if you'd like to. I'm also going to share the screen so that you can take a look at this with me. And we'll look from the very beginning. So, like I said, we started with rising from sleep with gratitude with these words, Moda'ani or Moda'ani. We took a look at where the weekday siddur shows that all together. We also see entering the prayer space. We skipped a little bit over that Matovu. We weren't going to pay too much attention to that because, again, that's not really folded into the liturgy that we say all together. So it's not something that you need to navigate. And then we got into Birkot HaShachar, Blessings of the Dawn. We talked a little bit about the choreography and how that's where we actually start services all together. And we start with a certain melody. We begin with Weekday minor. We spoke about the word nusach and this idea of the music of the liturgy and how nusach is the combination of mode and motif. The mode being minor and motifs being series of notes that are used over and over to tell us what time and what season we're in Jewishly. So weekday minor goes like this. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan l'sech vivina, lehavchin bein yom uvein laila. And each of the blessings are said in that formula. And we continue all the way through Pesukei DeZimra in exactly that nusach, in that mode and with those motifs as well. And we begin with standing choreography, and then we sit down when we finish those series of blessings, and we stay seated until we get to the different kadishes. We spoke about the choreographies that are optional when it comes to these two different kadishes. Highlighted in red here are the different pieces that are divarim shebikdusha, that are reliant on having a minyan, a prayer quorum, in the room. Everything else, though, can be said on your own because, again, you could be doing it at home, right? So that gets us through Birkot HaShachar. That's what we looked at last week. And now we're looking at Pesukei DeZimra. We're looking at these verses of psalm or song that begins on page 16. These are paginations in that newer 1999 edition of Siddur Sim Shalom, lovingly referred to as the Slim Shalom, which you might have in gray or in red. If you're looking at it in the thick blue, smaller edition from 1985, or the larger hardback edition that I think Dan had in his hand, in that edition, I believe you can find it on page 22 or something like that, because we begin on page 10 there with Birkot HaShachar. I don't have that one directly in front of me right now. When we look at Pesukei DeZimra, we also begin that section of the prayers standing, same nusach, no switch in nusach, and no switch in prayer leader at that point. So neither the musical modality nor the prayer leader switches at that point, but we do rise in acknowledgement of the beginning of the new section and in the acknowledgement of the new blessing that's going to get us started. Baruch she'amar v'haya ha'olam. Blessed is the one who spoke and brought the world into being. It is a poem that ends in a blessing. Melech mehulal batishbachot, the sovereign one who is praiseworthy in praises, exalted in praises, lifted up in praises. And then we continue with Pesukei DeZimra for quite some time. We're going to look in depth at Pesukei DeZimra in just a minute, and then we'll continue to Shacharit after that. But before we do, I'll stop the screen share, and I'll open to any questions about what I reviewed. So anything about what I went over that you have questions about or thoughts about before I move on? Denise, go for it.
Just a comment. So when I was saying the prayers this week, I was thinking to myself, long blessing, excerpt, thankful, like I felt like I knew what was going on because I did know what was going on. So it made it really like I felt much more connected.
Great. I'm so glad you felt more connected. And I'm glad that you reminded me that we talked about also long blessing last week and this idea that blessings are formulated in different ways and that sometimes we start a blessing and then we get so carried away, it gets so long that we have to restart the blessing formula again at the end, which is exactly what we're going to look at with Baruch She'amar in just a minute. So that was great. Thank you for that reminder. I'm glad it's working for you this week. Great. Okay. Should we look at the prayer book? I think we should get into Pesukei DeZimra. And today, in particular, I'm going to begin focusing a little bit for the sake of the particular crowd that's here in the Zoom room, and also for the sake of those who might be listening along. I'm going to focus a little bit on the nusach, but mostly on the structure here, how it differentiates a little bit from what we do on Shabbat morning. So beginning here, and then as we get into Shacharit as well, I want to pay attention a little bit comparatively between how we function on weekday mornings and how we function on Shabbat mornings with prayer, because they're ostensibly the same parallel structure, but there are departures here that are really important that help us to notice what it is that we're doing differently on Shabbat morning. In the case of Pesukei DeZimra, which we're about to dive into, on Shabbat mornings, we're adding. That's not always the case. When we get to Shacharit, we're going to get past the Shema and the blessings before and after it. And when we get to the Amidah, it's actually the case that the Amidah for Shabbat contracts. Right? But in the sections before it, it's that on Shabbat, we're making additions for the most part. Right? So noticing where the prayers expand and contract, where they change and don't change, can be really interesting if your point of reference for the prayer book is primarily Shabbat morning. That might not be the case for everybody who is here, for everybody who's listening. But for many people, I think for morning services, your point of reference is likely to be Shabbat morning. So I want to point that out starting here. Let's take a look at Baruch She'amar together. I'll share the screen. Hi, Jen. Here we go. Okay. So let's begin with Baruch She'amar, which we do on both Shabbat and weekday mornings. And I'll start by saying, as I think I did last time, but I'd have to look back at my own recording and listen back to my own recording, that the real difference on Shabbat morning versus a weekday morning is the music. So when we start on a weekday morning, we are starting in the same musical mode, but it's the motifs that make the difference. On Shabbat morning, we're in a mode that we sometimes refer to as the Nishmat mode or the Pesukei DeZimra mode for Shabbat morning. And on weekday mornings, we stay in the same weekday minor mode. Does that make sense? Right? So, right. Sorry. I think I just misspoke there. We stay in the same place. We stay in the same mode, whether we're on a Shabbat morning or whether we're on a weekday morning. On a Shabbat morning, we're staying in the same Birkot HaShachar or Pesukei DeZimra mode as we would for all of Shabbat morning. On a weekday morning, we stay in the same Nusach mode as we would for Birkot HaShachar or for Pesukei DeZimra of a weekday morning. So there's not a change that happens there, nor is there a change in the person who's leading the service, in the Shaliach or Shlichat Tzibor. But there is a little bit of there's a substantial difference between what this exact same liturgy sounds like on a weekday and what it sounds like on a Shabbat morning. So on a Shabbat morning, it sounds like this. Baruch She'amar v'haya olam baruch hu. Right? We're already into a major mode. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam. Baruch She'amar v'haya olam baruch hu. Baruch Osei v'reshit. Baruch Omer v'osei. That's the mode that we're in on Shabbat morning. So we're in major. If you're in a weekday morning, we're just in weekday minor. Baruch She'amar v'haya haolam baruch hu. Baruch Osei v'reshit, Baruch Omer v'osei, Baruch Gozerem Kayim, Baruch Merechem al haaretz. What's your role if you're a member of the congregation, if you're a member of the kahal at this point, if you're listening, if you're not the person leading? First of all, you'll be invited to rise. Second of all, you can do this a little bit out loud, but you're basically singing this and saying this to yourself. Ideally, you're saying every word of this page to some extent. You can always say any of these words in English if it's easier for you, if the facility with the English is just easier. And you've got a lot of the transliteration here to help you get through that first top paragraph here. And then the bottom paragraph ends with a blessing. If you hang back while the leader says the blessing, Baruch atah Hashem melech mehulal batishbachot, you can say Amen. That could be your job there if you wait for the leader to say the blessing. And then when we finish with this page, we as the congregation are seated and we continue from there. The way that the rest of Pesukei DeZimra functions is the following. Each of the Psalms of Pesukei DeZimra has a peticha and a chatima. Now these are, first of all, they fit into two categories of our three categories of a prayer service. Each of these is a poem, and each of these is a piece of biblical liturgy, because they are all actually almost everything, but not absolutely everything in Pesukei DeZimra come out of Tehillim, come out of the book of Psalms, but some of these come out of Divrei Hayamim, some of these come out of other places in later writings in the Bible, but all of them are biblical quotes, and most of them are poetic, also in nature. Every one of them has an opening few words and a closing few words. The job of the prayer leader is to let you know where they are at any given time, and they're going to do that in Nusach. So they're going to let you know at the top of page 17, Hodu ladonai kiru vishmo, hodiu v'hamim halilotav. And then they're going to mumble. Shir lo zamarolo sichu v'chol niflotav. They're going to mumble, 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 until they get where? What happens after that?
To the square, you mean?
So most of the time, prayer leaders are going to come in where the square is, because that usually represents the chatima, lachtom, to seal, to finish off. Most of the time, that's where they're going to come in. Sometimes, though, the editors of the siddur made a choice that are a little bit different than other traditions of where we close off. This is actually a great example of one, which is why I'm bringing it up here, because some other siddurim, in fact, Daniel, the one in front of you may even have it here, I'm not sure. The other one, the 1985 one, if you check in that one, again, I keep looking, but I don't have it in front of me. Some siddurim have the chatima beginning here. Ki gadol Adonai hulav mehod, v'norahu al kol Elohim, ki kol Elohei hamim elilim, v'Adonai shamayim asa. So sometimes they may begin a little bit earlier, but they're going to finish at the end of the psalm no matter what, or at the end of the reading no matter what. Does that make sense? So it may confuse you because it's at the discretion of the prayer leader to start a little bit higher up if they want to, right? They might start in a little bit higher in the psalm. And then they move to the next page, to the next peticha. Hod v'hadar lefanav oz v'chadva bim komo. Is everybody following? You see what I'm saying? This is now on page 18. And now at the bottom of the page. And again, this is another great example. Here are two sets of lines about Romemu. Some people will start here at the first two sets of lines about Romemu. Some will start here. Romemu Adonai Eloheinu v'hishtachavu lehar kodsho, ki kadosh Adonai Eloheinu. And then they go to the next page. Page 19. Vehu rachum yichaper avav v'lo yashchit. And oh look, don't miss it. This page, do you see where it's divided into two? Do you see how there's another square right here in the middle of the page? So the prayer leader is going to break in the middle of this page and tell you that they're stopping here. Adonai tzavaot ashrei adam poteach bach Adonai Hoshea hamelech yahaneinu v'yom koreinu, and they're starting here, right?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but you're absolutely right. It's one sentence before.
Right. So Dan, I'm going to go back to that page to show everybody. Going back to page 17, you're saying at the bottom of this reading from Divrei Hayamim, they start back at Ki Gadol Adonai Hulav Meod, right?
Right. That's where the box is, right?
Yeah. So it just proves to you that these places where we come in and go out are really a matter of discretion. Okay? It's a matter of, the tool, the purpose here is just the following. We are trying to strike a balance here when it comes to a prayer leader at the front of the room at this time in Pesukei DeZimra and people who are praying in their seats. We're trying to strike a balance of private prayer and public prayer. What do I mean by that? What I mean is we're trying to keep on pace with each other, but this really is a private prayer practice, right? This is not us trying to fulfill obligation by means of a prayer leader doing something on our behalf. The person who's leading services isn't doing anything for any one of us during that time. We're just all praying in parallel, and they're setting kind of a pace for us. They're letting us know where they are. Do you have to follow their pace? Well, the answer is
rhetorical.
I mean, you definitely do not have to follow their pace. You absolutely do not have to follow their pace is the answer. There's a consequence to not following there are several consequences to not following the pace of the prayer leader. All right. I want to name two of them as we get there. One is practical and one is more the philosophy / halacha of prayer. But we'll get there in a second. Let me go back to where I was on the middle of 19. When you get to the bottom of this one, Hoshia et amecha uvarach et nachlotecha, and then the prayer leader comes back in and finishes Ki gamal alai. At the top of page 20, some people stand for this psalm, but only some. You could be some. Are you some? I don't know. Am I some? I'm not sure. Sometimes I stand for it. Sure. There are some traditions to stand for it, some not. This is a really important point in the prayer service because this is the breaking point where right here in services, meaning right at the end of this page, at the end of the Hoshia et amecha insertion, this is where, if it were a festival or Shabbat, a bunch of additional psalms would be inserted. So the weekday Pesukei DeZimra service is like a regular size Oreo, and then like festival and Shabbat makes it double stuffed, and they stick it in right here, right? Or I guess it would be more like a club sandwich. Does club sandwich have like 3 layers? Is that a thing? Right? Did I get that right? I don't know how sandwiches work. I'm clearly mixing all my metaphors, but basically it's like an additional layer. Okay, it's like another floor stuck in there, and it's stuck in always, always, always right here. And you can see it right here. The Psalms for a festival are recited, and then it gives you the page numbers right here, right in this spot. You got it? So this is the spot right here in the service, and on those days, this Psalm would be omitted. Okay. And then even on those days, we come back to this very same spot. And if it were Shabbat, we'd be in a different musical mode. But because it's weekday, we're still in weekday minor. And we finish with Vehu rachum yichaperavo v'lo yashchit. And again, this is just the prayer leader setting the pace at the beginning and at the end of each of these paragraphs. And then we get to Ashrei. Here's where I want to say the two things about what happens if you don't keep up with the pace of the prayer leader. Number one, if you don't keep up with the pace of the prayer leader, eventually, since we're almost getting there to the end of Pesukei DeZimra, you are going to hit a point where if you don't keep up with the pace of the prayer leader, we're going to transition into the Shacharit service itself, and you may not have finished Pesukei DeZimra. So you've got to figure out if your pace isn't the prayer leader's pace, what is your pace? That's all. Second, there is an idea that gets sussed out, it gets teased out in rabbinic literature about what the minimum is required to complete Pesukei DeZimra. The rabbis asked this question based on the idea, what if you come to synagogue late? Like Jews would come to synagogue late. But actually, it's a very good question. What happens if you come late? What are you supposed to do as your minimum of a Pesukei DeZimra service? Their answer is this. You should do Baruch She'amar, Ashrei, and we're getting to it in a minute, Psalm 150. If you have time, you should also add Psalm 148. I would add, if you have time, you could add Shirat Hayam too. But in order to know that you're going to minimally do those things, right? If you're going to buy into, if you bear with me on this, if you buy into the import of the rabbinic system as the skeleton upon which you're building your own worship itself, if this structure is what gives life to your own worship practices, right? Your own spiritual practices are built on the authenticity of this rabbinic conversation, as mine are, as many people's are. Authenticity.
Wait, you cut out. I didn't hear you.
Can you still hear me now?
Now I can.
Now you can hear me. If you want to buy into that idea that, if you want to buy into the idea that there is authenticity to this rabbinic system, and you like the conversation, that there's a fixed minimum and that there's reason and good reason to that fixed minimum in this authentic system, that there was good reason to say you should start with a blessing and land on Ashrei, because Ashrei is something that we say several times a day, and that you should finish with the last psalm of the book of Psalms because that's a nice symbolic gesture. Well, then you've got to pace yourself that way, right? So you've got to make it to those. So if you're not following the pace of the prayer leader themselves, then you've got to pace yourself somehow. So I'm pointing out to you where the Ashrei falls in the whole structure of it, because you want to make your way back to, can you hear me again? Great. Sorry, it was just a crackle on my microphone.
Your audio
for me.
Switching sources, I think, is what's happening.
Yeah, it's switched back. I don't know why my Focusrite does that sometimes, but we have magical fairies who will help me on this recording, I hope, because they're very nice and helping polish up where it cracks through. So, so I was going to say is that what I really, really hope is that you see that there's a value to saying, I like that the rabbis think that it's possible that I can't make it all the way through Pesukei DeZimra every time, and that I might even find value in relying a priori, right? Before the fact, I might rely on the idea that I don't even wait until I'm late to synagogue to say I'm going to do a minimal version of Pesukei DeZimra just so I can linger a little more because these words are tough, right? But that while I do that, I'm going to do it based on the outline that the rabbis suggest, which is start with Baruch She'amar and at least make it to these, as I love this phrase that Rabbi Kligfeld often uses, an archipelago of prayer, these little tiny islands of prayer we're going to make it to. Okay, so I wanted to lay that out for you as an idea that you'll make it to Ashrei, and that, let's look at the next few. Remember, Peticha, Chatima, the opening, the close, or you're ignoring it, and that's okay. Or you're doing it in English, and that's okay. So here's the next psalm. And then notice, by the way, the structure of this. Psalm 145, Psalm 146, Psalm 147. Are you seeing a pattern? Psalm 148, Psalm 149, and finally Psalm 150, the last of the book of Psalms, which is familiar to so many people. It's all the different instruments with which we might praise God. Kol haneshama tehallel, kol haneshama tehallel, hallelujah. Every living creature should praise God. And then, here's a really important choreographic point. I stand here. Other people wait to stand until the next paragraph. I stand right at the end of Psalm 150. Others choose to stand at the following paragraph, Vayevarech David et Adonai le'inei kol hakahal. And then we have several anticipatory paragraphs, 1 page worth, that lead us up to this Song of the Sea. We begin quoting the scripture itself, the canonical poetry, 2 categories, of Oz Yashir, here on page 27, if you're looking at the Slim Shalom. And we go through the entire Song of the Sea, and we end with Adonai Yimloch Leolam Va'ed, Adonai Yimloch Leolam Va'ed, and then a little quote from Tehillim to end the entirety of Pesukei DeZimra. So Pesukei DeZimra gets us up to Psalm 150, then to Kil Adonai HaMelucha, this little paragraph, and then we end. You can ignore this. This is an extra little poem. People love poems. They stick it in sidurs. That's great. I love that sidurim are full of poetry. It's just extra. What's this doing here? I don't know. Somebody thought it was very nice. You can ignore it. We end here, okay? Kil Adonai HaMelucha Moshe bo goyim ve'elu Moshim behar Tzion lishpot et harisa ve'hayta l'Adonai HaMelucha ve'haya Adonai lemelech al kol haaretz. Some people get fancy and they anticipate the change in the nusach and the change in the prayer leader by changing the end of this paragraph towards the nusach they're about to go to, the music that they're about to go to, which is the music of Shacharit itself. Adonai echad u'shemo echad. That's the music of Shacharit. So some people anticipate that music a little bit. And this is the break at the end of Pesukei DeZimra itself. So we end Pesukei DeZimra standing at the Song of the Sea. Right? We end it standing at the Song of the Sea. So the structure, to go back to it one more time, got to move this out of my way, 1 second. The structure of it one more time to go back to this is Baruch She'amar, a bunch of psalms and biblical readings for every day. Ashrei, Psalm 150, Shirat Hayam, this tiny paragraph, Ki Ladonai HaMelucha, and that's your oral clue. After we finish the Song of the Sea, that little paragraph, Ki Ladonai HaMelucha, is your little tiny oral clue that we're about to switch prayer leaders and that we're about to go into Shacharit itself. I'm going to leave this on the screen and open to questions before we switch over to Shacharit. Thoughts, questions?
In terms of the minor versus the major.
Sure.
I'm just assuming because Shabbat is a festival, that's why it's in the major key, right, versus minor during the week?
So, not necessarily at all. Because on Shabbat morning, when we get to Shacharit, at this point in the service, on Shabbat morning, we would go to a minor key. And major and minor, major being happy or festive, is only considered such in certain Western cultures. And so Jews who are from other parts of the world wouldn't even necessarily agree with that sort of diagnosis, right? Or prescription. And it's simply the nusach that became the tradition out of the Eastern European customs and the countries from which we've collected those traditions. So there's a collection of countries that became Ashkenaz, that actually the Jews from the western parts of Europe migrated to. And they collected all of these different tunes together, and they became a collection of traditions. And those traditions are what we call the nuschaot of the Ashkenazi tradition, and those are what we sing from. And on Shabbat mornings, it just so happens that we use this one major thing in the morning, but then we switch over to Yedidai, da-da-dai, da-da-da-dai-dai, which is a minor modality. So major, just minor. Just the way it is. Just the way it is. And then we go into Fregish after that, which sounds like Fiddler on the Roof. Yedidai, da-da-da-dai-dai-dai.
Now then, to your point about Ashkenazi traditions, so is it with Sephardic, is it different, or is it just what they happen to,
Yeah. So it's different in two ways. One is that musically, it's very different. The modality that they use is very, very different. Secondarily, it's different in a completely, I would say, surprising and sometimes confounding way if you're not used to that tradition. And they would probably say the same in the inverse in visiting an Ashkenazi synagogue if they're not used to that tradition. I say it in the first person visiting synagogues of Sephardi backgrounds, which is that there isn't this rhythm of going quiet and then getting loud together and then everybody going quiet and coming back together loudly. Rather, everything is done in an out loud chant. So it is a constant togetherness of out loud chant and noise. And it's really beautiful and a bit cacophonous and invites participation through all, especially when there's a long series of psalms together. So it's a very Ashkenazi thing to do this whole piticha, and then everybody gets quiet, and then everybody gets loud again. Any other thoughts or questions, particularly on Pesukei DeZimra, or on the idea of the weekday morning starting, or how it's different than Shabbat? Okay, Shacharit. Before we get into Shacharit, stop the screen share for a moment, and I want to share something that's a little bit broader culturally about participating in this service. I want to introduce a concept about participating in the structure that becomes much more critical at this juncture in the service than it was earlier, and then it'll come back alive again later. So here's the idea. It's going to sound silly and simplistic, but here it is. Green light and yellow light and red light moments in the service for talking. Okay? It's not choreography as in bodily choreography in the service, but it is really important choreography to know and understand in the service. When is it okay to just be chatting? When is it kind of okay, but you should really be whispering to a neighbor or limiting talking? And when is the ideal that we're not disrupting the prayer service or interrupting the person talking? Some of these norms are really specific to the synagogue that you're in. And some of these norms, most of them, are really general norms about how a traditional service is supposed to run. And the most important one comes right here. Okay? And that is the idea that from the start, particularly from Yishtabach, but even better if you can make it happen from Baruch She'amar, but particularly on a weekday morning from Yishtabach, we try not to disrupt any of the prayer service of our own prayer service, meaning our own recitation of the services. We try not to disrupt it with any chatter from this moment until we've finished the recitation of our own private Amidah. So the ideal situation is that from the moment that we personally recite Yishtabach Shimcha La'ad Malkeinu, which we're about to get to, till we finish our own private recitation of the Amidah, we do not chatter at all. We don't say anything but the words themselves of the liturgy. We're trying not to disrupt that liturgy. I would call that a red light window, if possible, in the liturgy. We're trying to keep it uninterrupted, particularly because the Shema is found within it. It's considered a unit of prayer. We try not to disrupt it, and it's the reason why we shy away from making page announcements. It explains why, if you were to log on to Zoom services tomorrow morning at 7:30, right as we're switching prayer leaders, you would hear Michael Harris say, Paul or Avi or whoever, will you please lead us in Shacharit? Great, thank you. Yishtabach is found on page 29. Baruch Hu is found on page, we're not doing Baruch Hu on Zoom, but this is found on this page. This is found on this page. You'll find Shacharit on this page. After this, you may be seated. And then there are no announcements until the Amidah, because we're trying our very best not to interrupt it. It's also the reason why, if you're in a traditional synagogue space and it's a Torah reading day, you'll find that this is a time during services when honors are not handed out in the service, because we're not going to go up randomly and say, hi, good morning. Would you like to take the second Aliyah to the Torah during this time? It's also not that long a time. You'll see how quickly this goes, because this is pretty short, because as I said before, on a Shabbat morning, there's liturgy added. So a weekday service is pretty darn short, right? Even the space between Yishtabach, which we're about to look at, and Baruch Hu is really short. Because does anybody here, without looking at your siddur, does anybody here know what would happen right after Ki L'Adonai HaMelucha U'Moshel Bagoyim, that little paragraph after Az Yashir? What happens on Shabbat morning after that paragraph without looking at your siddur? Does anyone know? I'll give you a hint. It's a poem, and we often sing it. I'll even hum it a little. But I'll hum the part we go into. Bayom Hu Yihyeh Adonai Echad U'Shmo Echad. Nishmat kol chai tivarech et shimcha Adonai Eloheinu. It's 2 entire pages of a really long poem, which is entirely optional anyway, but not optional because it's a great poem, right? So of course we do it on Shabbat and festivals when we're doing services. It's a bridge between Pesukei DeZimra and Shacharit proper. But on a weekday, it's just not there. It just doesn't exist in the prayer book. So the whole thing is just tighter. It's tighter for a lot of reasons. First of all, Shabbat, it just has more, there's kavod there, right? Shabbat has more regalness. It's just Shabbat is Shabbat. Secondly, though, what do you need to do on a weekday morning? You can unmute yourselves and say,
get to work.
Yeah, you got to get to work. You got to get to school. You got to live your life, right? So we got to move on. So we've got to get this done quickly. So weekday morning services are chick-jock. They are moving along. So we are going to take a look at the beginning of Shacharit together, and we're going to take a look at how it's tight as a liturgical unit, particularly next to Shabbat services. I'm not going to show you on the screen side by side with Shabbat liturgy, but if it's interesting to you to pull out a Shabbat siddur and have it next to you, you're welcome to pull out a Shabbat siddur and have it next to you and open it up to Shabbat morning services to look at it. I'll point out where there are some differences and similarities, and you'll see where things get stretched a little bit on Shabbat. But obviously, the first thing that we're going to notice, in addition to Nishmat being missing, let me share my screen again, is the music. Because whereas on a weekday, here we're switching to, whereas on Shabbat, we're switching to Nishmat kol chai tivarech et shimcha Adonai Eloheinu. Here on a weekday, we are switching to Yishtabach shimcha la'ad malkeinu. Now, what happens on Shabbat after we finish those two big old pages of Nishmat? We switch to Shochenad marom v'kadosh shemo, right? We have Shochenad uvmakalot rivavot amecha beit Yisrael. So there's still yet more liturgy. There's Ha'el b'ta'atzumot uzecha, which is where we begin on festivals. Then the paragraph of Shochenad marom v'kadosh shemo. Then the paragraph of umakalot. Those three paragraphs, the whole page, also just not there on a weekday. And then Yishtabach. You just have to believe me. It's identical. But you could look at it yourself if it's interesting to you. So the only difference between Yishtabach on a weekday and on Shabbat morning is, what's the difference?
The music.
That's it. It's just the music, Annie. Which is why I, as a cantor, thank you for that great answer. It's why I believe so deeply in getting that nusach right. Because when you switch over to doing Yishtabach, if we do Yishabach Shimcha Lahad Malkeinu on a Tuesday morning, well, come on. That doesn't get us in the mood for Tuesday at work or school or whatever, right? We want to be in the right mood, and we don't want to give people a heart attack and think they're in for a long service. We got to move it along quickly. Yishabach Shimcha Lahad Malkeinu Ha'el HaMelech HaGadol VaKadosh B'Shamayim U'Va'aretz. And just like everything else in a weekday service, it also can have a peticha and a chatima. This is true on Shabbat as well. For a lot of stuff in services, we can start at that beginning, go quiet, and then come back in at Berachot vehodahot me'ata bi'ad olam. Baruch atah Adonai, El Melech Gadol Batishbachot, El HaHodaot Adon HaNiflahot, HaBocher B'Shirei Zimra, Melech El Chei HaOlamim. I love this blessing. We're not going to get deep into it. Not this time anyway. It's beautiful. It's the same, like I said, liturgically as it is on Shabbat. It is also just like the blessing that started Pesukei DeZimra, and this really ends Pesukei DeZimra. See how the page still says it's Pesukei DeZimra, even though we're in Shacharit? Remember I said we were in Shacharit? We switched leaders and everything. You believe me, right? We switched leaders. We switched music. But the page still says Pesukei DeZimra. Why? Any guesses?
In my book, it says Shacharit.
Great. That makes it even more interesting, right?
Mm-hmm.
What does the bottom of the page say? Oh, there is no bottom of the page on here. Cute. Any other guesses?
Wait, is it because it's before Kaddish?
Before Kaddish and before, what's the next page? Baruch Hu.
Baruch Hu.
Right? So it's just a disagreement. It's just not even a disagreement. It's a fuzzy line. It's nuance. Don't we love nuance? Nuance is funny in this way. We've changed leaders. We've changed nusach. We're already out of the Psalms. We're way out of the Psalms already. But here is a final blessing that is clearly a blessing of the nature that belongs to Pesukei DeZimra. Blessed is the God who is the Bocher B'Shirei Zimra, the one who is the chooser in the songs of song. Melech Elchei Haolamim, the sovereign, the God, life everlasting, who is the God of praises, the God of wonders, the creator of wonders, the one who chooses in the songs of song. Or the poems of song, if you want to put it that way. I think, it's fuzzy line. It's sort of the end of Pesukei DeZimra, and it's sort of not. And then there's Chatzi Kaddish. And what's the job of Chatzi Kaddish always? The job of any Kaddish is to be the role of a divider, like in a folder. Anytime you see a Kaddish in a service, it's present there to tell you that something new is coming and you are about to move into a brand new section of the liturgy. That Kaddish, as Denise was hinting at, is really there to tell us the Shacharit's for sure coming. Okay? That Kaddish, as is indicated on the prayer skeleton, is a Davar Shebikdusha. The Kaddish and the Baruch Hu that follows after it, these require a minyan. Starting at Yishtabach itself, you're invited to rise in the service, and we stay standing through the Baruch Hu. If you were to go online these days, we do Yishtabach, and then we sit, because we don't do this particular Kaddish. We only do mourner's Kaddish. So we skip this and we skip Baruch Hu. Everyone with me on that? We do Yishtabach, and then we skip Chatzi Kaddish and Baruch Hu, because we're not doing Chatzi Kaddish or Baruch Hu these days. Those require a minyan in person on a weekday. We pick up right here at this blessing. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, yotzer or uvorei choshech, the creator of light, and another word for creator of darkness, osei shalom, maker of peace, uvorei et hakol, and the creator of all. Denise, did you want to pipe in with something?
Yeah. I don't know if this is a subject for right now, but how come certain things require a minyan and certain ones don't?
That is a great question. Let's sidebar that question, and I promise to come back to it. That's a wonderful question, and I'll get deep into it. You're absolutely right to raise it. And what I'll address for right now is that it is for certain not everything, right? It's actually a very small category of things. And I'll get into how those things got assigned to be in that category of things, but it's actually a very small category. So I can get more into that, just not in this moment. But you're spot on to note that there are things that must have been assigned to that category, and I'll get into that a little bit later. I'm not sure if tonight, but for sure in this class. Thank you for that question, and I will write it down so I don't forget it. How Divarim Shebikdusha got their name. So, I want to show you something on the prayer skeleton. Every service, I'm going to give you a special hint, both morning and evening. So this is true. What you're learning right now is true for both morning and evening services. Every service, both morning and evening, has exactly the same structure to it. Every Shacharit service and every Mariv service has exactly the same structure, and it goes like this. Call to worship with Baruch Hu, 2 blessings, first about light, then about love, the Shema, a blessing about redemption, Ga'al Yisrael, and then the Amidah. That exact same structure happens over and over. In the evening, there is one extra blessing that happens. I'm going to show you where, and then I'll take it away from the skeleton. It happens right here, where I'm putting in this extra bullet. It's a blessing called Hashkivenu, asking God to watch over us because nighttime is scary. And then we add in a Chatzi Kaddish in the evening. In the morning, that's not there. There's no Chatzi Kaddish. We go straight from redemption to the Amidah, ideally without even stopping to say Amen, depending on which authority you ask. Okay, so same structure always. We always say blessing number 1 about light, blessing number 2 about love, Shema, blessing number 3 about Ga'al Yisrael, redemption, and then Amidah. On Shabbat, there's just more stuff stuffed in there, more poetry stuffed in there. But on a weekday, like we were saying before, we got places to be. So what have we done so far? In Shacharit, we started with Yishtabach Shemcha La'ad Malkeinu, one really short paragraph, and then Chatzi Kaddish, Baruch Hu. That's what we looked at so far. Baruch Hu is a call to worship. We've stayed standing for Yishtabach, for Chatzi Kaddish, and for Baruch Hu. The prayer leader bows. Baruch Hu et Adoshem Hamvorach. We bow in return. This is all with a minion in person. Baruch Adoshem Hamvorach Leolam Vahed. Prayer leader returns the bow. Baruch Adoshem Hamvorach Leolam Vahed. And then we're seated as we say this extra blessing that's not counted in those blessings. See this little Yotzer Or right here? Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam yotzer or v'orecho shachoseh shalom u'varei et hakol, we say to ourselves. And then we have these couple of paragraphs. They're lovely. They're very poetic. They're all about the one who shines light on the earth and awakens sort of the grasses and the creatures of the universe, the God who's great. This is poetry. You know how this is poetry? I'm going to show you how you know. Because the editors of the siddur highlighted for us that this is an acrostic. If you've ever said this paragraph and you've thought, these are weird words, someone seems to be trying very hard here. El Baruch Gadol Dea Hechinu Fa'al Zorei Chama. That sounds, it rhymes a little, but also it sounds like a little bit of awkward on your tongue Hebrew. That's because they're working very hard. Have you ever, do you remember doing those acrostic poems for somebody named like Annabelle? And by the time you got to like the third E in it, you're like, what's another E word? I mean, really, like they're working very hard in this acrostic poem to get fancy words in. And then by the time they get to Tav, they just go on. Misaprim kavod elu kedushato, right? Telling of the glory and of God's sanctity. And then to this line, Tiparach Adonai Eloheinu al shavach ma'aseh yadecha, on the praise of the deeds of God's hand. Ve'al me'orei or she'asiti afaruch hasela. We're still talking about the praise that we're giving God for the lights that God puts out in the universe. We always start with the praise about light in the universe. So this is opening poetry about the lights, the orbs that God created, the sun and the moon, because that's the celestial, the ideation of about celestial creation that God made at the beginning of the world. And then a couple more paragraphs, we get to this concept of a miniature Kedusha that happens here. This is all leading up to this first blessing about light. We get inserted into this structure here, this little miniature back and forth of a Kedusha. It starts at the beginning of this page with a little bit of a poetic insertion about the angelic being. And actually, we can read it in the English first. It's kind of fun. Okay, here we go. You fashion angelic spirits to serve you in the highest heavens. In chorus, they reverently chant words of the living God, the eternal sovereign. Adoring, beloved, and choice are they all. In awe, fulfilling their Creator's will. In purity and sanctity, they raise their voices in song and psalm, praising, extolling, and exalting, declaring the power, holiness, and majesty. So this is all about the vision of the angelic creatures up in heaven praising God. Where else do we see that in our liturgy? Where else will we see that a little later on? In the full... Denise?
Is there a part in Kedusha when it talks about the angels?
Yes, exactly. And we get to this miniature Kedusha here. So here we have V'chulam mikablim alehem ol malchut shamayim ze mizeh. And they all receive upon them the yoke of the kingship of the heavens, one upon the other, and they give permission one to the other. Lehakdish liyotzram menachat ruach. B'safavira, they do this in like clear and nice language. Everybody's saying kulam ke'echad, each of them all of them as one, kulam ke'echad, onim, answering, ve'omerim, and saying be'yira, in awe. All of them as one answering and saying, which is why we all say together this bold line, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzavaot, Meloch ha'aretz kevodo. So the line here speaks to the choreography, which is, even if you've gotten lost in reading the English of this liturgy yourself, because remember, we're not chatting with one another at this point. We're in our own Shacharit davening, our own Shacharit prayers ourselves. Even if you've gotten a bit lost yourself, you want to find yourself back here together with everyone answering, Kulam ke'echad onim ve'omrim be'yira, and saying, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzevaot, Melech kol haaretz kevodo, ve'ha'ofanim ve'chayot ha'kodesh. And these different types of angelic creatures that are sacred, but ra'ash gadol, in this great noise and crash, mitnaseim lumat serafim lumatam mishabachim ve'omrim. Again, this inviting language that they're going to declare together. Baruch kevod Adonai mimekomo. Blessed is the glory of God from God's place. Baruch kevod Adonai mimekomo. Or Baruch kevod Adonai mimekomo. You just followed the lead of the leader. Whatever they're using in their nusach, you followed their lead in singing along with them. So this also exists here in transliteration on the next opposite page, right? Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzvaot, Melech haaretz kevodo. Same with Baruch kevod Adonai mimekomo, because we're encouraged to sing along. All right? Those are two really critical sing-along points. And then we go quiet into our own private whispered prayer. Le'el baruch nemo titeinu. Whisper, 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 whisper. As we pray quietly, this paragraph, this final paragraph about God being the creator of lights. And then we have the person leading say out loud, Or chadash al Zion tahir, a new light will shine over Zion. V'nizkeh chulanu mehera le'oro, and may we all soon merit in its light. Baruch kavod, Baruch ata Adonai yotzer hameorot. And that's blessing number 1. So I walked us through that page pretty slowly, but it only takes us one page. Remember, the page before is Baruch Hu. This is the Baruch Hu page. This is the next page in Hebrew that gets us to blessing number 1 after that little miniature Kedusha.
So that Kedusha doesn't exist in the evening version.
Correct.
Even though the evening... rest is
yeah, say that again?
Even though the rest is similar, you still say the Shema, you still have the Baruch Hu.
Yeah. The attempt in the evening prayers is to make it, again, because of nighttime being scary, as short as possible, as very short as possible. The only thing that was added was the prayer for nighttime being scary, which was Hashkevenu, which did lengthen it by that one paragraph. But everything else about it is shorter. This is taken out. Those first paragraphs about Hameir La'aretz also taken out in the evening prayers. It is really short in the evening, and no repetition of the Amidah. Right? So it really is as short as we can possibly make the evening services, because we want to get people done. Yeah, you're absolutely right. This one is not present in the evening. So that's it for Yotzer HaMe'orot. And that's where we end this little bit. That's a great observation. Any other observations or thoughts on this page? Anyone notice any other poetry or interesting things about this page? All right. Last thing I'll point out is that Kulam Ahulim, Kulam Be'rim, Kulam Giborim is a nice little attempt at a miniature acrostic. I always enjoy that. Okay. Let's look at one last page and then we'll end for tonight. Next page, which people tend to be really familiar with because there's some great tunes written to it. Ahava Rabba Ahavtanu. This is exactly the same on weekdays liturgically as it is on Shabbat. Just different music. Ahava Rabba Ahavtanu, with a great and abundant, deep love. You have loved us, God. And this is the love page, the love prayer, and about our loving relationship with God. This is done entirely in a whisper on a weekday, because we're not going to go singing this page all out loud. On a Shabbat morning, we might be singing Ava Rabbav Tanu and V'ha'erinenu and V'havienu L'Shalom. All sorts of great melodies. On a weekday morning, we're trying to get through. So we're davening. And as we get to the bottom of this page, if you're wearing a talit, we gather the corners of our tzitziot, because this last paragraph speaks to V'havienu l'shalom me'arba kamfot ha'aretz, God gathering us from the four corners of the earth. So we gather our fringes in anticipation of what comes next? Shema, exactly. These are the first two blessings before the Shema. That's the way to have a participatory class, is to have people think you're muted and you just say stuff. It's great.
So I guess that's not a coincidence that the paragraph before literally says four corners of the earth.
No, not a coincidence at all. And by the way, I don't know if people think very often about the profound Zionist and theological statement being made by singing that paragraph to Hatikva. I'm sure the first time that it was sung, it was both deeply emotional and deeply Zionist, and now I don't know how much people think about that. V'havienu l'shalom me'arba kanfot ha'aretz. Singing that paragraph to the national anthem of Israel, and will be gathered from the four corners of the earth, is like that's a pretty, to tie that messianic idea of God gathering us from the four corners of the earth to the idea of the modern state of Israel is really powerful. That's a very strong idea. And then the blessing that ends this page is Habocher, the one who chooses, or the chooser of, Be'amo, in their people, Yisrael, Israel, Be'ahava, in love. God loves us. God keeps choosing us. And on that, so the first blessing is on light, Yotzer HaMeorot, the creator of the lights. And then Habocher Be'amo Yisrael Be'ahava, love. And then we've got our fringes gathered, and we go straight into the Shema. I guess I have one last minute to add a thought. That in this COVID time, you may notice that when we get to the Shema, we add these three words, El Melech Ne'eman. We add those because if there's no minyan, we're adding in these extra words at the beginning. So these are added anytime that we're praying individually, which is its whole own subject, not just during COVID, but generally, all of these prayer services can be prayed individually. None of them are restricted to being prayed. In fact, all of them ought to be prayed individually if you can't pray them with a minyan. Ideally, they're being prayed in their proper times by you individually. You just skip the things that are Devarim Shebikdusha that can only be done in a minyan. All of them can be done by you on your own in English if you need to or want to. I'm going to stop the screen share and leave this open for a few minutes to any questions or comments or thoughts that are lingering for you.
That was a lot of information.
So the overview for today is that we, every weekday morning, get through a Pesukei DeZimra that could be as minimal as Baruch She'amar, Ashrei, and Psalm 150. And you could spend all your time just getting through those three, and you'd be fine. You'd be kosher. In fact, you'd be adhering to an authentic, minimalist Pesukei DeZimra to warm you up to get into the Shacharit service. And then we get to Shacharit, and we quiet ourselves to prepare for an uninterrupted prayer service. And so far, we have gotten to the call to worship, which comes right after Yishtabach. So Yishtabach into the call to worship, which is the Baruch Hu, a brief blessing of Yotzer, and then we've just gotten up through the first two blessings before Shema. Next week, we'll pick up with the Shema. We'll do the blessing that's after it, and we'll move on after that to the Amidah itself. But the structure of Shacharit it's really tight. It's just this few pages of, it's really intended. It started as this vehicle to help us get to the Amidah. And it was built out with the Baruch Hu and with the Shema. And now are just these islands of blessings that come between it. It's pretty simple. I'm trying to help you understand the structure as straightforwardly as I possibly can.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.